Welcome to the Expansive CEO podcast. I'm your host, Hannah Chapman, founder of Expansive CEO and X Squared Wealth Planning. Buckle in as we explore how to create true prosperity and build a business and a life that expands beyond yourself and makes a dent in the universe. Welcome, everyone, to this episode of the Expansive CEO podcast. I'm your host, Hannah Chapman, and today I have a guest who I have had the pleasure of we've met a few times now and gotten to have several really fun conversations. And I'm really excited for you to be here. So Jenna Dillon is my guest today. She's an executive coach and a keynote speaker and the CEO and founder of Executive Performance Institute for Coaching, which is EPIC, EPIC. And she works with high-performing individuals and top-tier organizations, helping accomplished and aspiring leaders achieve greater levels of fulfillment and success in their lives, careers, within their organizational cultures, and as industry influencers. And we're really going to dive into that high achievers column today, really based on, the people that I know who listen to this podcast, who are in my audience, who work with me. We've got a lot of high achievers that have overcome a lot of perfectionism in their past and are maybe still working on that, or maybe in the beginning stages of that. And so it's a really, really beautiful place to dive in together. So Jenna, thank you for being here, and tell us more about who you are, who you love to help, why you are in this space.
Yeah, sure. So, hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for having me, Hannah. Who am I? Well, I will give a brief nutshell background to give you at least a glimpse of who I am. I used to be a professional dancer in my first career. So, first and foremost, even though I'm in a career that is very psyche and scientific based, if you will, I actually am more of an artist and creative at heart. And I actually think that's something that is a asset that I bring to the table in my line of work. And so on that note, I consider myself a creative analyst. Like I'm an intellect and I'm a creative in one. So that's what you get. And outside of like just describing myself that way, the people that I have chosen to work with in my career are high performers. As you can imagine, being a professional dancer, whether you are a professional athlete or dancer or artist, that can be a really kind of grinding environment that one can build a lot of traits themselves and then know archetypes of identifying it in others on who and when they can be a high performer and have certain tendencies that come along with that. And so for me, I get really motivated by impact. And so when I was first building my career, I was thinking of what kind of audience would I have the most impact in, because there can be high performers, high achievers in any industry, even at any level of an organization. And for me, really picking top tier organizations and the top leadership leaders of those organizations was really key, because to me, it was this idea of a ripple effect of where I could have the most impact of not just the people in the organizations, but the clients they serve and the way that they model something that could even be reshaping and influencing their industry. So that's a little nutshell about me.
Well, and you reminded me of one of those like sparks of recognition between us. And one of the reasons we clicked so well
Mm,
is because I was a musician, uh,
mhm.
and my degree is in flute performance, which also highly, highly competitive. And I do credit that to a lot of, um, my resilience, my tenacity. A lot of that was built through music and musicianship, because especially, this isn't necessarily the case for everyone, but if you get through, a college level degree or a master's degree in music, typically these are very, very hardworking people. I practiced multiple hours, 2 to 3 hours every single day on top of, all my schoolwork, teaching, working. Um, And I really, really dedicated myself to what I was doing. Um, Even in middle school and high school, right?
Hmm.
Like this, it was important to me, which I know dance is usually the same. You usually start pretty little.
Yeah.
And it's a big part of your life. And so yeah, I just wanted to, bring that back into the room to the creative and analytical side. It brings this holistic view of a human being
Hmm.
that we don't necessarily get all the time, from, there's not really a replacement for having been immersed in a creative um uh thing for, decades of your life.
Pursuit, environment. Yeah, absolutely. Like being in something like that for a majority of your life, or even a pretty big chapter of your life, it's a really wonderful experience. And how to, I don't think it necessarily always needs to be replaced, but how do we move that forward and apply what we used in that chapter in a way that's going to be really helpful for us? And how do we, as humans, tap into our creativity if we're not used to tapping into our creativity? For those listeners that maybe don't see themselves as a creative, or weren't in a chapter in their life where they were necessarily pursuing something they saw as creative. But then on the flip side, for those that do or did have that season in their life, being aware of not just how to bring that forward and apply it, but what are the tendencies that you learn that actually could inhibit you also, right? And so that's some of what I think we're kind of planning on discussing around, like, what are the different ways for someone to build their awareness and attunement, to be able to access and optimize like what they have, and build an awareness so they can, prevent the not so helpful tendencies coming up.
Yes, yeah. So that's so beautiful because when we start talking about high achievers, like that dovetails perfectly into, a lot of the people that I work with as well and identify with.
Hmm.
I also identify with being the achiever at work,
Hmm.
being the one, like I was always striving to be the first chair flute player in whatever group I was in. A lot of times I was, right? I worked really hard at that. Um, Things came naturally and I worked, right? So it was both. And so, when you have a natural aptitude for being able to learn things quickly and do well, and a work ethic to go with it, that's, like I should always be at the top of what I'm doing. Right. And that was the kind of the mentality of my 20s for sure.
Yeah.
Um, Carried into my 30s. As I started having kids, there started to be more things to juggle. It gets harder. But that didn't go away still. And
What would you define that as? That didn't go away.
the that inner drive,
Mm.
my inner drive to do well and to be successful and to continue to grow, right? That was very innate to me. Even
Mhm.
as a child, I didn't need anyone to ask me to study or to get good grades. Like that was I had that inside that I just
Yeah.
did it.
Yeah.
Um so yeah, I identify with this very much, and I would say there's been a lot of healing in the last 5 years, really, around that. What I would call like that high achiever is also the perfectionist,
Mm.
and a lot of perfectionist tendencies with that.
I,
For me, they went together.
yeah, yeah, I can definitely see that, over the course of my career. And I actually call myself a recovering perfectionist. So we're simpatico, Hannah. And another area is, yeah, like if someone identifies or has identified as a perfectionist, then they likely, like, all perfectionists are high performers. I will say not all high performers are necessarily perfectionists, because there are situations where they might not be specific to that perfectionist, have perfectionistic like expectations. I'll say it that way.
Interesting. Although the Venn diagram could be the other way too, which we don't need to go down that rabbit hole too far, but perfectionist tendencies can also tend to hold us back, right? Like
Oh yeah.
you're not actually achieving as much as you could because
Well, yeah.
the perfectionist doesn't allow things to go out until they are perfect.
Yeah, and case in point, like one of the things I think that you and I do, why we do what we do is because well, I'll speak for myself and you can add your bit to this is, I get really interested and curious and passionate about how can I help leaders, like top performing leaders, that they are at the top of their not just organization like structurally, but in their performance or maybe even their industry. And how can we help them reshape what's possible and have them accomplish more? So actually breaking this glass ceiling of high performance. So to your point, yes, like there's a certain archetype that comes with perfectionist. And I would actually say tendencies perfectionists have, high performers can also have, both of which they have tendencies that inhibit their capabilities. And that they unintentionally do because they're high performers or they're perfectionists. They don't want to inhibit what they can do. They want to do more. They want to be perfect, right? So, or they want to be the best. So, yes, I think something to where what we're talking on is how can they? How can they break past that glass ceiling, if you will?
Yeah. Oh, it's so good. It's so good. So I'm going to relate it back to my experience, and then I want you to talk more about how do you I don't want to say systematize, but like, yeah, like how do you work through this with
Yeah.
people? Because for me, being all through my 20s, mostly, I was 23 when I started at the large broker dealer that I worked at for a long time, for about 14 years in total. And, being the high achiever, wanting to do the best at what was put in front of me, like do this thing, I'm going to do that thing, right? Learn this script so you can sell financial planning. I'm going to learn the shit out of that script. I'm going to know every every sentence. It still was
Done.
terrible, right? Because it's a script. It was
Yeah.
awful. But that's what I was told to do. Dial these numbers, like make this many phone calls, talk to this many people, get this many appointments. Like I was on it. I was doing the best that I could, and it felt awful.
Hmm.
But I was doing everything I was being asked to do and doing it well.
Mhm.
But I almost gave myself ulcers
Hmm.
in that, 12-week period. And then even moving into the paraplanner role that I moved into after that first stint of being an advisor, even there, it was, I have to do a good job because I was at that time the breadwinner in my family. My husband was in grad school. Um, and I was the main wage earner, and it was like, okay, I gotta do it. I gotta do a good job. I have to do the best possible job. And I did a great job.
Mhm.
And I did such a great job for the next, 10 years, 13 years, that I made myself almost irreplaceable, in the sense that I had elevated back to an advisory position, but I still couldn't get out of my support role. I was still doing half of my support role and being half an advisor, because the rest of the team was like, no, you can't, like, we need you to do these things. No one else can do these things. So like that glass ceiling for me was, you can't be the fullness of who you want to be, because we need you over here, because you're just, you're too
Mm.
important over there.
Mm. That sounds
And
hard.
it was hard, and it didn't feel good, and
Right.
there were a lot of aspects that didn't feel good about it, but that was part of it, was that I couldn't extricate myself from that role
Mhm.
in that place. I couldn't be the advisor that I wanted to be. Um, I couldn't even get clients the way I wanted to get clients. I couldn't be the fullness of who I am
Mhm.
in that space with those other parameters that I was being, trying so hard to meet these people's expectations that didn't match who I was. And so
Mhm.
when I left and got to be me, basically, I'm I'm like I'm astounded. I'm astounded at the progress, at the things I have achieved, at the way it feels, at the clients I get to work with, the fact that I have a podcast, like what the heck? This is like everything that I dreamed of
Mhm.
on the other side of trying to achieve to someone else's standards when I get to just be me and achieve to my standards.
Mhm. That's beautiful.
Thank you.
That's really beautiful. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's great that you're able to see the contrast compare from one season or chapter of your life to now.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, but there are so many people who are stuck
Hmm.
in that spot, right? Of like, I am so good at my job that they won't promote me anymore. There's a glass ceiling right there.
Hmm.
Or I'm so, like I'm so good at this one thing that I'm afraid to try this other thing.
Hmm.
What if that doesn't work? What if I'm a failure over there when I'm such an achiever over here?
Yep. Yeah.
There, there are
No,
lots of things
absolutely.
that can show up. How do you
Well,
see it?
and I think that when one thing that I appreciate about your story and with the example that you used is, people will find themselves in places where their glass ceilings aren't things that they can break if they stay in that environment. Where in other situations there are glass ceilings that were self-inflicted that they didn't realize were self-inflicted and they created it, and so with kind of both things, like I will call your example an extrinsic glass ceiling. It was happening in your external environment that wasn't between your ears. So if we were to call the intrinsic glass ceilings, is what's going on between somebody's ears and how are they creating limitations or inhibitors that are actually preventing them from moving forward in the areas that they want, right? And so it was a beautiful like example of how one can have a glass ceiling per the circumstances and environment that they're in a work scenario, and then seeing how you were able to make a choice of, no, I'm not going to stay here. I'm going to get out of this so I don't have that glass ceiling, and I'm going to go past it. And then you did,
Yeah.
right? So yeah, I mean, that's definitely like kind of different angles in which I would see situations that people can be in and where those glass ceilings or limitations are actually rooted in. Are they intrinsic? Are they extrinsic?
So let's talk about intrinsic glass ceilings then.
Okay.
Yeah, tell me more about that. What does that look like? Um, when you're working with someone and you're noticing, what does it sound like? What do they say that helps you identify that?
Yeah, I mean, so I will start at surface level. Surface level, here's what it might look like, and it could be a myriad of these things. And by the way, depending on how long somebody is experiencing it, they might uncover like the next layer down, right? And so their surface might be one or two layers deep than another person's surface. So with that said, I'll list out a variety of different levels. I'll just say that. One is, I'm exhausted. I am working 60 plus hours a week and I feel trapped. Like I've created, or maybe they don't even say I've created, they just say, I feel trapped because I don't know how to slow down. If I slow down, it's at the detriment of the organization's success and everybody involved. And I can't do that. But I'm exhausted and it's really taking a toll. I don't know what to do. Mayday, mayday, mayday. So, and that might seem like to them an extrinsic challenge or glass ceiling.
Yeah.
I would actually encourage the listeners to think, is it though? Like who, and this isn't on, these are honest questions, is who made decisions that allowed you to be in that spot? And what decisions did you make, whether that you didn't make or did make, that got you to this trap, as you say? Because it's looking at our part. So that's one example. Another is like they talk about time management, and they're saying, oh, I don't know how to delegate well, or I need to create systems, or I need da, 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 da. And it could be all these like time management things that are on the surface of, or there's a certain, I'm not trusting this person or this team, or I need them to work better and be more productive. They could be talking about that on the surface when really like an intrinsic challenge or root cause to that could be that they haven't learned how to communicate to that specific team because they're not used to really absorbing or understanding how the leader's communicating, right? Or it could be they don't know how to motivate someone to get results in this way because they've never done it before, right? So it could be a motivation piece. It could be, and all of this, by the way, is around how to improve their leadership skills and their approach to specific types of either personalities, teams, etc., right? And I'm just speculating, of course, like of what some of the root causes might be, but pointing to on the surface, it can look extrinsic, but when we dig into finding the root cause, it's actually intrinsic, right? And the deeper we go into surface to root cause, where we find that gold nugget at the bottom layer, if you will, often it is like 90% of the time, it's rooted in emotions of either feeling like they are afraid they're going to make a mistake or fail in some way, or if they're going to be reprimanded or judged if they do make a mistake, like they're okay failing, but the impact of other people's opinions matters, right?
Mm.
And then the fear of success is also there. And some people are like, what do you mean they're a high performer? How could they be afraid of success? But it can happen, y'all, because they could have all these thoughts around success of, well, if I reach this level of success, I'm peachy. But if it's this level and it's 10 times that, oh, no, 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 no. That comes with too much responsibility. That comes with things that would overwhelm me, stress me out. I don't want that. I don't want that. And so they find like all these different ways of viewing the world of why they're going to be in this window of success or failure. Right. And so whether it's I can't fail in this way or this much, so I have to succeed this much, and then, oh, can't succeed too much because that's not good either. That's too much for me to handle. I don't know how to do that. Da, da, da. Nope, that's not going to work. So then there's this window, right? So root causes, it's like how we relate to ourself and our self-worth, what we deem that we are capable of, what we deem of where our worth and value comes from. Like you mentioned earlier, perfectionist. Often perfectionists feel the need to prove their value, even if it's to themselves. And it's because of not how they're just relating to success and failure. It's because of how they're relating to self-worth and where self-value even comes from, right? I hope I'm not serving you a drink through a fire hose, Hannah. There's a lot there.
Oh, it's so good. It's so good. And as you were talking, I think this the concept of having a fear of success
Mm-hmm.
is such a powerful question to look at
Mm-hmm.
because a lot of people will hear that and be like, that's BS. Like that's dumb. Who has a fear of success? And then when you peel back some layers, it's a lot. There
Mm-hmm.
are a lot of people.
Yeah.
And those stories can come up around, well, it could be money stories, look from the lens that I look through. Well, people who are that wealthy are all assholes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If you have that much money, you're a bad person. If you've done this, and that is actually a very common story
Mm-hmm.
that people hold, that rich people are terrible.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have that much money, that you will then be a terrible person.
Yeah.
Um, there's also, the fear of leading, oh, if I grow my business, then I'm going to have more employees and I have to lead all these people. And that's just no, right? Like that seems scary. That's
Mm-hmm.
another one, right? That's a fear of success.
Mm-hmm.
The fear that it's going to be hard to
Mm-hmm.
lead people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I have a dear friend who is brilliant at what he does, and he is he's in software development, which is very, brainy. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but he's also a musician,
Mm-hmm.
and or was a musician, and so he has this, from sitting in an orchestra and like listening to all these different, always having to work together, literally with a symphony. Um, and understanding where different parts were at all different times, he has this holistic view of the teams that he works with. So here's my thing that I'm working on, but hey, wait a second. If we do this, it's going to affect them over there. Hey, team
Mhm.
over there, when you move this thing, it's going to affect us over here. And I would share with him, I'm like, that's special. People, other software developers don't do that. They work
Mhm.
on their thing and they're like, I'm done. I did my thing.
Yeah.
They don't have a holistic view. And so when I say like, have you ever thought of being like a chief information officer or chief technology officer? Like that's the level of thinking that those positions have. How does this affect the business as a whole? That's not an individual contributor type thought. That's a leader type thought.
Yeah.
And he was like, "Oh, I don't know. Those guys work so much. I don't want to have that much, I don't want work to be that big of a thing in my life. I don't want." And it's just so interesting
It
to,
comes with all these different, like learning about the different assumptions or preconceptions that people will have on what it means if you were to be in this situation. What would it mean if you were in this? And what are the, social constructs or norms around what that would entail,
yeah,
and I think if I may, like something that I may pull the curtain back, excuse me, on why is it that people will even do that and even think about like it makes sense why we would, but maybe I could pull the curtain back on a little bit of like I might sound like a super nerd, but I'll give some layman's terms and some technical terms. But if you aren't into science, you will still be able to follow this. But like, why does our brain do that? Right? Why do we go into trying to assess and analyze and justify to ourselves why we would or wouldn't be okay in that scenario and what that scenario would even entail, right? And so from a very high level or conceptual standpoint, the way our brain is wired, I'm going to give you a little bit of neuroscience here and you'll totally see my analytical brain. But that we have a few different kind of sections, if you will, of how our brain's wired. And if you think of our prefrontal lobes, like closer to like our forehead, right? We have our executive state. I'll just call it a region where our prefrontal lobes lie, and it's often the area where we do the most learning. And so when someone is in and firing up that part of their brain, they're often, let's just be very general and say, like, they're often in a place where they can ask themselves, what can I learn from this? Great. Well, behind that, where it gets a little bit deeper to the brain stem, which is at the base of the neck, behind that executive state is the emotional state, right? And so it's our limbic system. And often when we have that part of our brain firing up, we are asking or thinking about, because it's the emotional state, like, am I loved? Right. And we're focused on like what emotions we're feeling and often how we're impacted relationally by the people around us. We have that part of our brain firing up. And I promise there's a point here because I'll get to like, why do we process things this way? At the base, the brain stem of our brain is our survival state. And when we have that survival state firing up, it is the brain stem. It's the root of where our brain will go to. And the purpose of our brain is to keep us alive and keep us alive and make us survive. Right. And so if that state's firing up because we feel threatened or afraid or uncomfortable, whether we are literally threatened by our life or have the perception of it, that goes on, and our brain is wired to keep us alive. So it asks the question of, am I safe? Okay. Now note, our brain's main purpose is to keep us alive, not to make us happy. So if we have that survival state is at the base, then that will take over all the other ones if we don't feel safe. So if we're looking at a work environment and we have a little bit, even a little bit of discomfort or a little bit of apprehension or doubt, that starts getting triggered. Okay. And we go into our analytical, logical side of our brain because that is how our brain gets utilized in that state. We do not process emotions the same at all when we do not feel safe or when we feel uncomfortable. So part of what I love and find so interesting about the work you and I do, Hannah, is that we start to help people discern. Like we literally have to help them slow down their processing and discern their situation. One, so they don't get in this fight, flight, freeze, faint, fawn state. We're so used to saying flight, right. Oh my gosh. Flight, fight, and freeze, but there's the two others. There's the fawn and the faint. But we want them to get out of that so they can actually discern the situation of is it an actual threat or not? And then they can start firing up and utilizing more of their brain, their intellect, and their the right and left side of their brain, right? They're creative, they're intuitive, they're emotional, and they're logical and analytical. Because if we're not helping leaders or individuals use both parts of their brain, their discernment's not going to be as sharp and as clear and as strong as it could be. It isn't. I mean, just think like if you're not using both parts of your brain, yeah, you're not going to be as effective, right? So we get into that, am I safe? Because we're in that state of fear or worried some way. So logically, it's all logic, 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 and intellect, right? When it comes to performance and hitting results and KPIs in a work environment, it often will get translated because I mentioned root causes, right? Around fear of failure, fear of success, all that. It isn't, am I safe? The biggest fear that underlines it is, am I a, what do you think?
Um, the what was coming up for me is, am I worthy? But I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good one. Am I worthy? Am I a failure? Am I an imposter?
Hmm.
Like all that, right? And it's all similar state, people. Like this is how our brain's wired. It's because your survival state mode's coming on and you're getting into protective mode. But just because you're getting into that state doesn't mean it's an actual threat. It also doesn't mean if it is an actual threat that you're putting yourself in a state to problem solve best. That's where we come in, right? Like, and so it's anyway, I hope that that was kind of informative for the listeners on this, because if we aren't understanding how it works, then we can't understand ourselves as to how and why we're getting into these modes. And then being able to observe us get into that and help us self-manage even, right?
Yes. Yes. And what comes to mind, I just had a coaching client earlier today, that we're working on, just talking about invoicing and at the beginning, sending a proposal at the beginning, invoicing throughout the process of the work that she does, and getting into, talking about the fear state that
Mm-hmm.
that can come up when saying, "Hey, all right, there's, the rest of this invoice is due. It's $3,000 or $7,000," and that's the second half, right? They've already paid up front for a portion of it, already agreed to, like that none of this is a surprise, but there's still this fear that comes up around, oh, now I have to collect money again. Right. And there's so the fear of that, like how does that get in the way? Well, it gets in the way in a lot of ways if we think about that, right? Like
Yeah.
you got to get paid in your business. So
Yeah.
basic, important thing, right? You've already made the sale, you've already done the work. Now it's time to, collect the remainder.
Mm-hmm.
But there, yeah, like you can sit and be in fear of that.
Mm-hmm.
You can also bulldoze over the fear, be
Mm-hmm.
like, it doesn't matter, I'm going to do it anyway. But neither of those actually gets you to a place of, like you said, having that full access to your whole brain,
Mm-hmm.
the full capacity of how you can create a better solution until you address the fear,
Mm-hmm.
until you find that fear and identify it
Yep.
and
Yeah.
allow it to be there, talk to it, right? And then move through it in a gentle way rather than bulldozing it. And that's
Yeah.
the way that I see it anyway, and that I process help people process through it.
Yeah, and I often when I'm working with clients, some of them might be highly intuitive, highly creative, and even highly like using, I say emotional because they're using that part of their brain that's more emotional. But it doesn't mean they're like emotionally weak. Uh, and then there's other people that I work with on the far side of the spectrum that they're highly strategic and analytical and process oriented, linear, structured in that way. And there's no right or wrong. There's no good or bad on either. But the reason why I bring it up is because as they start developing themselves and in their leadership style and within their discernment, decision making, how to prioritize and delegate differently, all of that applies, right? First, intrinsically. As they're learning that, they start identifying whether they have the language or not, like areas of themselves that start feeling dissonant, where it's like, well, I'm confident, but we're just now finding a thing that makes me feel insecure. So there's a dissonance. Like I thought I was confident in who I was. That's just a simple example. And I think for the viewers, I mean, you and I, Hannah, can have so much fun talking about root freaking causes and deep stuff. And so, for the for the listeners here, like, yes, like yes, we can talk about this until the cows come home. And something that I think can be really helpful for anyone in any part of their growth process is in order for you to, in my humble opinion, in a healthy, helpful way, lead yourself forward towards growth, if that's what you're committed to, is to keep practicing and modeling these four traits is humility. Like, no matter how confident you are, you can still be humble because the second then also leads into this is curiosity. Like, we can logically say there's no way any person will know everything about everything. Duh. Like we know that. So then watch your expectations and get curious, even asking yourself, one of my favorite questions of a leader who I have admired for my whole career is Ed Catmull. He's the president of Disney and Pixar Animation. Of course, he's a creative, but he's been coined the most successful filmmaker of all time. So he passed Disney. Let's just make that clear. He's freaking brilliant. Okay. And he didn't do it because he's just a creative. But my point is, is he, in a book he wrote, he talked about how he asked himself a question every day. And even with his coined term and his success, he says, what is it that I'm drastically wrong about that I think I'm right about? So he
Interesting.
prompts himself on this assumption of error, and it keeps him curious, it keeps him humble, right? So how can you practice humility, curiosity? The other is ownership, right? How do you practice like taking ownership of what is your lane and responsibility and what's your ownership to take on the impact that you are making for yourself or other people? And then where do you overtake too much ownership? Like how can you assess that, right? But ownership. And then the fourth is drive. You mentioned it earlier. You had this grit, perseverance, or drive, internal drive. If we don't have that, we're not going to want to move forward and have anything to change, right? So, really looking at all four of those and just continuing to practice that in a way of attitude and way of being and living in your life, I think you will innately, whether you mean to or not, you'll innately start growing in ways that will translate eventually into results, even if you don't innately focus on that. So as a starting base, I know we're talking about like root causes earlier, but it's like, hey, let's just breathe for a moment. And someone's like, oh, I don't even like I'm imagining people who are like, okay, they're talking about deep stuff. Success and failure. I don't know if I have that, but like that's deep. That's what about higher up? What's something that could be even more accessible if the stuff that we were talking about earlier wasn't, right? So, what are your thoughts, Hannah? Like, would you contribute anything else around like traits to model, or what do you see from you working with clients?
Yeah, those were really good. I find curiosity to be one of the most important tools in the toolbox for
Hmm.
sure. If something's coming up, let's be curious about that. If someone says something, um, in I mean that's the kind of stuff that I'm like paying attention to is like, oh, wait, hold on, you just said something interesting. There was a money story in there. Can we go back to that? Right. And
Hmm.
I'm curious about it. And the invitation for them to be curious too. Hey, if this comes up in your daily life, right now that you're aware of it, can you be curious? Oh,
Hmm.
that happened in my call with Hannah. Like, it's coming up again. What's happening here?
Yeah.
Right. Just being that curiosity is so valuable
Hmm.
as an awareness tool. And then from awareness, that's where is it coming from?
Hmm.
Where is that? There's
Yeah.
at the beginning of the journey, it's hard to do that for yourself. And that's where having a coach, a mentor, someone else who can see outside of you from, you're inside your own glass house, right? So it's like you can't always see what's right on the side of your face.
Yeah.
Um, but having that other person to reflect that, hey, I'm noticing this.
Hmm.
What do you, oh, okay. Yeah, I feel like that's one of the biggest values.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, of
Absolutely.
the self-reflection paired with, the trusting relationship of, this person wants to help. This coach wants to be there for me. Um, could be a therapist, it could be, whoever your person is.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, having that outside reflection until you're until you're better able to see a true reflection of who you are.
Hmm.
I think a lot of
Yes.
times high achievers have a distorted view of themselves.
I think, and this is my creative angle that I'm gonna like add to what you're saying is, are we ever really done in knowing who we are?
Mm-mm.
Because the moment we think we are, oh, well, then I guess we are. And thus then we put our own cap as to how we are or won't be. Right. And so that isn't that like I mean, and this is getting perhaps philosophical here, but isn't that a beautiful thing about us? We can continue to evolve. We're fluid. We're actually a fluid concept, right? So why not like keep exploring and be interested in seeing how we would intentionally want to evolve in ourselves, but then also what are we noticing? Like we can be that observer, as weird as that might sound. We can be an observer to ourselves and learn about ourselves from observing rather than just making an intentional choice about how we want to change,
Mm.
right? So I think to your point, like there's both ways that a coach, or I'll just call them a support system professional, because like there can be a lot of different versions depending on what you want support in, that one can grow an awareness and continue to grow in their awareness and in themselves at the same time. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounded like another uh, intrinsic glass ceiling, if you will. If you think you're done growing, right? No,
Yes,
you put that on
yes.
yourself.
Yeah, and I'd say like, often and this is where I find like uh, I want to give hope to the high performers in the world because, when I say, well, are you ever really done? I even mean in terms of performing, like, but it doesn't mean it has to be hard and it has to be grunt work and it has to be hustle and it has to be go and you have to accomplish more. No, like, there's all these other different ways to be relating to it all, where if there was that curiosity and creativity and play, like wouldn't it be kind of just fun and cool to it's like you continually get to like interview yourself? Or what about if you then played that to like everyone else that you know? Think about how much more rich and how much more depth like you would have in those relationships with people and respect that they would have for you because they would feel like you are continuing to be curious and understanding them, and there's so many layers that one can receive and learn and get from others in doing that, right? Like, so it's again like a beautiful aspect that if we can just relate to it in this playful, curious way, it's not a bad thing that there's gaps and things we don't know about ourselves. It's actually a beautiful thing, and it's how we approach it Is it hard? Does it have to be go, go, go and hustle? Or is it, let me just see what I find? Like, yeah, I have these goals, but what's the purpose of getting the goals and the process of it, right? Like, there's all these different ways that we can relate to it and actually create a really meaningful, fulfilling experience in the process, not just the accomplishments of a goal.
Mm, absolutely. Absolutely. And we're going to leave it there for the moment because I want you to be able to tell people how to find out more about you. Where can they go to learn more about you and your process and just hear more of what you have to say? I would love to invite that.
Oh, thank you. Sure. So simple. I'm on LinkedIn, so you can find me on LinkedIn, Jenna Dillon. Another simple way to reach me, my email is quite simple as well. It's jenna@jennadillon.com. Last name is spelled Dillon.com. So if you have any questions about what we've talked about today or about my process or anything of how to bring the creativity and like right and left side brain, I'll just say that together. That's my jam. How to like increase high performance, but that way. I love meeting new, interesting people, even coaches like you, Hannah. Like I think we've talked about that also outside of just the content of what we do with our clients and why we do it. It's also the context of like the community that we're around and even making our industry elevated from the knowledge that we have and learn from each other, like how we can just, ripple effect that. So professionals in our world too, I'm happy to talk with.
I love that. Love that. Jenna, thank you so much for being here today and having this conversation with me. I think it's so powerful. And as you said, if anyone has any questions or if something really resonated for you or made you think, we would absolutely love to hear about it. I always love hearing your feedback, your questions, truly, truly. And if follow me on any of the social media platforms, you can leave me a message there. Or you can always get me at Hannah, HANNAH, at expansiveceo.com if you have any questions. So all of Jenna's information will be in the show notes down below. Super easy to find. So Jenna, thank you so much again. It was such a pleasure to talk with you today.
Thank you. Thank you again for having me and having fun in this conversation. I really enjoyed it.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening and be sure to like and subscribe. And again, if anything resonated with you from this episode, I would love to hear from you. Email me at Hannah, HANNAH, at expansiveceo.com and tell me about it. And if you're ready for your greatest expansion, you can find ways to work with me at expansiveceo.com and at x2wealthplanning.com. That's X, the numeral 2, wealthplanning.com. So until next time, remember that there is enough, you are enough, and your birthright in this lifetime is to be expansive.